Welcome to The Real Math of Business with Alena Bennett, where you plus this podcast equals better decisions. I'm Alena Bennett, speaker, author, and leadership expert. I work with chief executive officers and chief financial officers really to help them create universally investable companies where people serve people and the math just works. This week I'm chatting to Steve Vamos, but first, here is my thought-provoking question. My thought-provoking question for today is a question, but it's also a process. It is the question why. And the process I'm talking about is the 5 Whys process, which many of you will have heard of, created by Toyota in Japan. Why I'm sharing this as my thought-provoking question is actually it was a process that I went through recently. It's a very reflective time. We're coming into the end of the year, and I pulled out an old facilitated journal. It's called the Big Journal, and it is taking me through a series of steps. It's revisiting concepts like growth mindset, resilience, things like that. The process it took me through was the 5 Whys process. So, I know 5 Whys. I've taught 5 Whys. I've done 5 Whys. But what I find with things like that is sometimes it's helpful to do it again. And so it just asked me, think of one of the failures that you've experienced recently. And it just took me through the process of, this is what didn't go so well, or this is what I failed at. Why did you fail at that thing? And it was really interesting because the way it had me do it in the journal was it made me keep writing, why did you fail at insert what you failed at. And so then you go and you answer the question, okay, why did you insert what you've just written in the question? And what I found out of that process, and that process, it doesn't take very long, was some real gold there. So what I would suggest is that you might think of either a success or a failure, because of course you can interrogate successes as well and think about how you might double down and build on those. But I think the question is why, not a judgmental why, but if you approach that question why from a place of curiosity, awareness, learning and therefore growth, I think it can be incredibly valuable and maybe uncover some things, on this side of the new year that could be really powerful as you take into 2026. So thought-provoking question for today, why? Using the 5 Whys process. And now to our chat with Steve Vamos. Welcome to the Real Math of Business podcast. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome today's guest, Steve Vamos. Steve Vamos is a global keynote speaker, leadership authority, and former CEO who helps executives and teams align strategy and culture to unlock growth and build high-performing organizations. With more than 40 years leading technology and digital media companies, including a CEO of Xero and NineMSN, and senior leadership roles at Apple, Microsoft, and IBM, Steve has guided leaders through disruption while scaling businesses to industry leadership and billion-dollar revenues. Twice named one of the top 5 most influential people in the Australian technology industry and featured on the cover of the Australian Financial Review as Business Person of the Year, Steve's insights have appeared in Forbes, Fast Company, Harvard Business Review, and more. He has also recently authored the book Through Shifts and Shocks, Lessons from the Frontline of Technology and Change. Well, wow, Steve, thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks for having me, Alan. I look forward to the conversation.
Well, let's jump straight in. I'm really curious, especially given the little conversation we just had. I'm really intrigued to ask this first question to kick us off. And the question is, how do you make sense of the business world these days? And I'd love for you to answer that question, in the present, and then also do a bit of a reflection for us and explain how that has changed over the years and over your quite illustrious, if I can use that term, career.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You're asking me at a good time because I've been doing a lot of thinking about this, about what is the problem, and in the context of thinking about a CEO's role, an executive's role, what is the problem that they're dealing with every day? And it is a function of what's going on in the world, which is only accelerating. It's only more unpredictable. And that is one word: misalignment. If you think about the role of a CEO or any person pursuing a goal and objective, the real challenge is to find alignment. It's to go on this journey of trying things, learning from failure, adapting your course until you get to that place where you really feel things are aligned. And so when I look at the world as it is today, change is just like in my early career in the 80s and 90s, every year in a decade had similarity. Whereas if I look at the last 5 to 10 years, every year has its own personality, its own challenges. COVID, and then, what was happening before COVID, then after COVID, and then things that happen on a global basis can affect everybody as well. Tariffs in the US. It's like every year is different. And the things we're worried about seem to vary a lot. So the good news is that whether it's moving fast and crazy or whether it's slower and still changing, the real thing to think about is, how do I go about recognizing misalignment and then addressing it in whatever context? And in a business context, as a CEO, I really believe that finding and fixing misalignment is basically your job. No one else can do it at an organizational scale, because a CEO is actually the only person who's cross-functional. And you might say, well, what about my CFO? They care about cross-functional. Well, no. They run finance. You should say, well, we've got a COO who handles quite a few functions. Well, they might be cross-functional, but they're really just part of a CEO's role. I mean, a COO is often, a CEO says, I want to bring someone to help me with these functions that report to me. The CEO still remains the only person who really cares about the cross-functional nature and capability and alignment of an organization.
And the thought that goes through my mind is to kind of synthesize that in my brain is when they call the CEO that role the chief everything officer. It does encompass everything.
Well, I call him the chief execution officer, right?
Ooh. Okay, tell me about that. I got to go
Well,
straight there.
because, look, the thing is that anyone can come up with a vision. Anyone. In fact, one of my favorite people in the world is the founder of Xero, Rod Drury. And when I did actually interview Rod once for a podcast. And there's a couple of philosophies that he believes in, which I think are really important. One is the power of belief. And he always talks about the confidence and belief he had in himself to be able to build the businesses that he has. But the other one is very simple. Do something. Do something. Like if it's not about the dream. It's about the action. And that's why the idea that CEOs are just these visionary, priority-setting people is not good enough, because the hard part is execution across their organization, overcoming the misalignment that will be inevitable. And that's why I think Chief Execution Officer is a better title for the CEO.
That's so fascinating, because I imagine there would be many CEOs and C-suites and boards actually that would be of the belief of get the CEO out of execution. That should be the remainder of the C-suite's job.
Yeah, and look, I think that where I'm a little different to those people are all my generation or, thereabouts. And the thing is that in their professional careers, they grew up in the 80s, 90s, and maybe into the noughties when things didn't change as fast. And I was really blessed because I was thrown into the dot-com boom in 1998 as CEO of NineMSN, which was a joint venture between Microsoft and PBL. And this joint venture was born in a market that didn't exist. There was no online ad market at the time. There was a couple of companies like Intel who were doing a little bit of experimentation with digital advertising. But the company was born with $100 million cash, 80 smart people that were quickly recruited, all the brands of Microsoft and PBL, which was Channel 9 and ACP magazines, all their brands, all the extensions of the internet of those brands, and 10 business plans that smart people had written to say, we can build something. And I got thrown into that as the first CEO. And even though I didn't found the business, I actually inherited all these riches. And it was working there that I came to see the things I believe so strongly, because when I went in there, I had everything you needed, but I had no experience in media and I had no experience in advertising. And every meeting I went to, I was the person in the room that knew least. So all I could do for the first couple of years in that job was fix misalignment. And there was plenty, misalignment of purpose, misalignment of priorities, misalignment of culture. It was basically a business that had everything tangible you could want and none of the intangibles. No management system, no values, no priorities, just aspiration. And being immersed in that for a couple of years was the greatest gift I think I've ever been given. It's why I'm here today. If I didn't have that experience, I wouldn't have written the book and
Mm.
probably wouldn't have, the rest of my career would have been different because having that digital experience at the very beginning is what, in a sense, led to many other roles that I moved into. But the point about all of this is after a couple of years of leading that way, we emerged as a clear industry leader. We had a phenomenal culture. People loved it and still talk about it today as a special time. And things were working really, really well. Innovation was coming from people I never expected. So all the attributes of what everybody talks about as being good all emerged. And it all emerged from one thing, which is, in a sense, fixing problems, fixing the misalignment and being determined to do that. And because I couldn't lean on my experience as a technology sales guy, I had to stay out of the functional piece and focus on cross-functional alignment. And that's really my message to CEOs and to leaders is you've really got to work hard to get that clarity that is enterprise-wide and align action with that enterprise-wide. And that's not easy to do. It's a hard job and you're never perfect. It's one of those things I say, the more you do, the better things will be. So do more than you're currently doing.
I love that. You were thrown into this world and you sort of just had, I like what you said. The only thing I could do was fix alignment. The thought
Misalignment.
of fix misalignment.
Yeah.
The thought that comes into my head is particularly, given the kind of decades that you listed, quite often, over the last few decades as well, and it is changing, but not as much. Um, Technical experts are still being promoted into the top job. And they might not be the technical expert, but people that have industry experience or subject matter expert, right? So, and what I see, with the CEOs and the companies that I work with, that in those cases, sometimes it's very hard for them to get over themselves a little bit and stick in that CEO space as opposed to trying to solve the problem that perhaps you've already hired someone else to do. What's your advice? Or did you ever find yourself subsequent to your NineMSN experience? Did you ever find yourself confronted with that foible? But I'm guessing you also see that now in the work you do and the companies that you work with.
Yeah, I love what you said, getting over yourself, because being a really effective leader that deals with these problems is about getting over yourself. So there's a couple of angles to that. Like if you think about the journey of a startup, the founder of that startup initially is doing everything. So the challenge they have, and it's quite, I mean, I understand it. I'm not sort of, I don't want to be critical of people in that position, but as you hire more and more people, it's that journey of letting go of what you're good at to become an amplifier of others that becomes the role. And some people are cut out to do that and others aren't. And there's no shame in that, by the way. In a more corporate context that you referenced, which is, I'm a great sales leader. I've done sales all my career. I get elevated. I end up being the CEO and all I want to do is hang out with sales guys, make sales calls and focus on the sales rhythm. And that's a trap
Mm-hmm.
we all fall into. And that's a human trap, because it's called ego. My past success and knowledge is me. I'm attached to it. And actually, my past success and knowledge could be the very thing holding me back, because in times of change, it's dangerous. Like if you look at media, you look at technology, you look at retail, The organizations with all the past success and knowledge that had everything going for them failed and lost to new entrants who had nothing. So you've got to be really careful. Part of getting over yourself is letting go of that and saying, that's great, I've got it. It does not rule me. It does not control me. I'm happy to look at a situation today as completely new, and potentially what I learned, what I know, does not apply anymore. It's about really being strong. Another one is fear. Fear's a big driver, of what gets in the way,
Mm.
because guess what? Fixing misalignment only comes with difficult conversations. Difficult conversations are fear. So, for example, having clear priorities, as simple as that, clear priorities. I love when I was at Apple and Steve Jobs came back, and I was there. I was running Apple Asia Pacific when Steve came back as interim CEO. You know what Steve did to save Apple was cut 75% of the product line, prioritization.
Mm.
And if you listen to him talk about focus, he says focus is about saying no. It's about saying no. But with saying no comes fear of hurting people's feelings, because you're saying no to good people who have good ideas. When you say, no, we're not doing that. It's fear that, if we don't do that, we could miss out on the next big thing. So you have to overcome fear.
Mm.
So then on top of that, there's more. We can talk about that if you want me to keep going, but you are, and I am, and I'm not perfect I'm challenged every day. Every day I'm challenged to get over myself, my fears,
Yeah.
my ego, my conditioning, the conditioning from the workplaces I've worked in, which define my reality, conditioning from my growing up and my family about what's normal, what's not. All those things are
Mm.
things that when you're faced by change and misalignment, you have to be able to get over yourself and everything that you carry and look objectively at that situation, breathe, and try and assess and analyze with those around you what is the problem and what is the action I can take to fix it. Because as CEO, you've got no excuses. No excuses.
Mm. I'm curious. So I don't know if it was intentional, but I feel like we've just gone to the next layer of depth in this conversation. I'm a little bit excited. I want to talk, you mentioned, you talked about the human trap of ego, and then you talked about that ego being I'm attached to success, and actually what I need to do is detach ourselves. And then you talked about your experience at Apple, where Steve Jobs came in and cut 75%, and that led to fear. I
He
am
had to, he
also
had to,
guessing that.
he had to overcome fear and be focused in order to make that decision.
And I'm guessing, and I could be wrong, but that probably did something to you as well, that kind of went, "Oh my God, what the heck is he doing?" And that I'm guessing because of what got you here won't get you there. There was also a bit of a detachment that needed to have happened at that time as well. Maybe if you can run us through that, I'd love to know how it felt
Yeah.
when Steve Jobs came in and said
Mm.
75% of products are going, we need to be focused. Because yes, he had to get over himself and he had to, you know, put his
Yeah.
big boy boots on and have that difficult conversation. But I'm curious to know how that landed with you and what you felt at the time and how you overcame that.
Yeah. Well, look, focus was his superpower, and that sort of driven clarity that came with that. And Apple desperately needed it, right? Because I was there for 5 years, and I had two roles. I was country running Apple Australia, and then Apple Asia Pacific for a couple of years. And the company definitely needed discipline, and it needed to be clear about where I was heading. So I was able to rationalize that. But to answer your question, there was a product called the Newton handheld, and it was a little PDA device that was, it was like a serious product in our product range. And we had thousands of developers around the world developing software for it. And I sent Steve an email when we were told he was going to terminate that product. And I said,
Mm.
Steve, are you sure about this decision? We've got thousands of developers who we're going to impact by making this call. I'm just keen to understand how you feel about that. And he came back with a one-line email, which was, "We must save the Mac." So
Mm,
it was, a crisis for the company and needed to get the Macintosh core offering back to the
mm,
standing that it had and had lost, because previous leaders had lost focus, tried to do many things they couldn't. So on one hand, I was very uncomfortable about the good decision because I knew I was going to be part of communicating to people in Australia that were doing good
that's
work
right.
on that platform. But I also accepted the decision because I understood the situation. Went through fear, was it fear through to denial to acceptance or whatever is the
To accept, so then that sequence, but and I guess at some point in there, you could have experienced misalignment. So if we come back to your core premise that you've offered us so far, which is a CEO's job is to fix misalignment, tell us about that moment and where was the juncture where there was potentially misalignment for you, and how did you overcome that? How did you then get aligned? How easy was it for you to become realigned?
Yeah, that wasn't that difficult. Look, it wasn't something that tortured me. It was just I was more curious about how he was going to get his head around the fact that thousands of people doing work are going to be impacted. Um,
Mm,
and then, I couldn't, in the company, then you couldn't argue against the rationale that we'd spread ourselves too broad and we weren't really winning anywhere. So it
mm,
wasn't so torturous, really. I think probably the
yeah.
one that in my career has bubbled around a little bit is the misalignment I've personally had with the organization I'm working with and the role that um, I'm doing. And that misalignment isn't something that is constant because initially you are aligned because you join and you get engaged, but then over time things change. You find that maybe you're not learning as much in the role anymore. You might find that where the organization's heading, you don't fundamentally agree with. Or you might have a
Mm,
boss who behaves in a way that at some point is going to end in someone not being in their role and you're more likely to be the one that's not. So I think those things are the ones that are more, yeah, to me, that situation with Steve was a pretty straight up and down corporate
yeah.
strategy execution question. The really
Mm,
challenging one, the
mm,
misalignment. So for example, people who say to me, my bosses don't listen to me. And I'll say, well,
mm,
okay, tell me about that. Well, I sent my boss an email about a change I think we need to make, and I haven't had no response. And I said, well, don't accept that. Go and get a response. You shouldn't accept that because that's not something that sits well. The fact that you're being ignored, not listened to, not heard.
mm,
And then we'll talk a little bit more about, well, this is not a one-off. This is what my boss is like. And then my view is, well, okay, you should talk to your boss, but if you're not comfortable, maybe you can get a little bit of a coalition with some of the other people in your team to talk to your boss. There's ways you could do that. You could encourage some form of feedback session. And then ultimately, if that doesn't work, maybe you can talk to your boss's boss. But at the end of the day, if none of that works, leave because the misalignment between what makes you happy and your environment is not being fixed without some form of action. And they're the challenging ones, I think.
when did you learn that lesson? Because that takes courage and it takes conviction in yourself.
Yeah, look, I don't know. There was a moment that I learnt it, and even today, I've got a small team working with me, and one of the biggest challenges for us over the last year since I launched the book is me being clear enough about what we are going to do and not going to do. So now I think I've got
Mm,
there, so that's good, and now they're excited and they're energized. But until it's really just understanding and watching people around you and how lack of clarity or misalignment impacts on them. Um, it's kind of maybe in the context we started talking about, it's not, just a particular time that a misalignment between me and my work environment became a feature. It's really just the whole feature of work and what you're doing and the various misalignments, because you have misalignment. As soon
Mm.
as you take over a new team, you'll find there'll be people on that team who aren't necessarily aligned with where you want to go. In fact, some of them are already misaligned with where they are, let alone with anything you're going to change. So it's almost like, to me, the answer to your question is that experience at 9MSN. I think,
Mm.
when was it? It was in 1998 through to 2003. That is when I became the convicted kind of misalignment fixer. Before that, I'd been taught good stuff by IBM. I was there for many years, and IBM developed me as a manager, and I'm grateful for that because it was the best management school in the world at the time, and I was a beneficiary of that. And I got taught the right thing to do. But it was only after 9MSN that I became convicted about the right thing to do.
You've just triggered a thought in my head around misalignment. And what you said at the very beginning, in the answer to my first question, what I loved about your answer to that first question was, what was the language you used? Every year and every decade in the past has
Mm.
somewhat been the same, but currently every year has its own personality. I
Yeah.
think that's a really interesting way and helpful way to think about what's going on at the moment. Because every year has its own personality, every company is trying to adapt and respond to said year's personality in the context of the global and industry context.
Yeah.
Lots of change. With change is going to come lots of misalignment or lots of opportunities for temporary misalignment. How do you distinguish between temporary and systemic or long-term misalignment?
Well, I
Or is
think
there a difference, and how do you
yeah, there
distinguish
is,
between the
sure.
two?
Well, there's issues which are sudden that you have to respond to. Like, for a lot of small business people, when the tariffs came in the US, that was
Mm,
here and now. I am now no longer aligned with my customers in the biggest market I serve, for some.
mm,
So that
mm.
becomes, in a sense, a crisis that requires action until you get it. Because that's like a burning, that's a misalignment that is unavoidable. You can't ignore it. It's easy to see, and
Yeah.
you need to respond. Longer term misalignment can sometimes go unobserved because of some of the bias the leaders have towards their performance. That they'll say, oh, we're going well, we're up on last year, but maybe the market's growing twice as fast, which means as you're losing market share, you're losing relevance, which means if you're losing relevance, you are now misaligned over time with your customer base. So you need to sit down and have a good strategic think about what the problem is. And then you need to put action plans in place, which are not going to be overnight action plans to correct that course. Because as things change, the reality is you are a sailor. You are never going from A to B in a straight line. You are tacking
Mm.
back and forth based on learning and based on conditions. And why I'm so kind of worked up about this whole thing now, because everything on the planet that we want to fix is a misalignment problem. It's a misalignment between the way we function and the long-term outcome we want that we think is right for us, whether it's
Mm.
environment, whether it's inequality, whether it's diversity, like every single issue is that we today are not
Mm.
where we want to be. We need to change that. And the amount of time leaders actually spend in the hard work of fixing that is not enough. And it's not enough to leave it to, you know, people out there to figure it out. You can't. Because they will bumble along and they'll be busy doing busy work, but it's not going to add up to anything unless the
Yep.
leaders really embrace, depending on what the issue is. So you can have really transformational leaders within an enterprise who are doing great things and thinking ahead. But the trouble is, if the CEO and the leadership team aren't doing that, when that good leader moves on, it dissolves. So so short answer to your question is yes, there's a difference between the way you face misalignment that is more short term, high impact than longer term, long term impact, but the principles are the same.
Mm. I'm curious about how through your career, it sounds like starting, with 9MSN, how did you navigate that conversation with the board? Because yes, because there is a lot of busy work. There's a lot of how do we hit budget? How do we stick to the strategy? Oh my goodness, it looks like we're not going to hit budget. Oh my goodness, it looks like we need to change the strategy, but we just signed off on it 6 months ago. Tell me about how you've seen that board, how you've personally handled the board conversation over time, and how you continue to see it change, given that every year now has its own personality.
Hmm. I'm a real believer that a good CEO leads the board and has a strong relationship with the chair, who basically facilitates the board meetings and keeps them um, on the right agenda, and also keeps them on track with conversations and manages the different individuals around the board really well. And I've been really fortunate to work with great chair people and have great relationships with them. Um, Usually in normal circumstances, I've never had a real problem with leading the board through a strategy and budgeting process. Usually the point of contention is that they will push you hard for more, do more and spend less. That's the reality. Like it's almost like they're not doing their job if they're not pressuring the CEO to do that. And so that's the frustration or the annoying thing, because as a CEO, I would always go in with my genuine view of what is the right plan. I wouldn't go in there lowballing and, playing games. I don't play games. I don't play games. And that's hard because sometimes, particularly in multinational corporations, sometimes you're better off if you do play games. It's because like back in Microsoft, Steve Ballmer said to us, come to forward with your plans to increase our growth. And we did. And so they locked in the growth and they gave us half the money we asked for, right? So, from that point on, I didn't quite offer up as much. You live and you learn. But with let's say the Xero example, where it's a public company, we don't play games.
Mhm.
I always went in with plans I really believed in. Now, a good example of where it got tough was my era at Xero was the low interest rate era, and growth is good. Like my investor conversations and board conversations were, where can we put money? Where can we grow? How do we get bigger and bigger revenue wise? Then overnight with COVID, and I'll call it un-COVID, interest rates rise, money is no longer cheap. And overnight, everybody is saying, it's not just about revenue growth. Now it's about operating efficiency margin, operating margin. And so where the contention between me and the board was not in the need for us to shift, because it's inevitable. You have to shift with the world. That was huge, by the way. And I think, again, a great example, and I think a great credit to many, many companies around the world. Unfortunately, a lot of them, how they did it were perhaps more brutal than, I would be. I'm inclined to be, because it's about adapting your resources. Then you're letting good people go. And that's the worst thing that ever happens when you're running a business. But it's really then that you get into a contention of not so much what, but how are you going to execute that? And different directors and different CEOs, we all have different tolerances around patience. And so you have to come to some consensus about what is the right path going forward that balances what your owners expect with what you want to do in the kindest way possible for your people. And that's one of the toughest judgment calls you ever make as a CEO and as board directors is, do we hit the brakes hard and that has impact on a lot more people? Or do we hit the brakes slowly and try and, get through it with less impact to people? And there's no right answer. There is no right answer, because whatever you choose is the only thing you can ever compare. Like you can't go, well, if we'd have done it differently, it would have been a lot better. You can't tell, but that's the judgment call. But I've always found that with a good chair and with an understanding that I have to be ahead of the board, I have to lead the board and not let them lead me. I think I've always had good relationships, and the way we've responded to change at Xero, as we did many times, and in other environments, the 9MSN, the board of 9MSN, generally speaking, good people around the table trying to do the right thing.
I'm curious. You've started talking about numbers. You've talked about growth and top line versus bottom line. I'm curious, where and how does misalignment show up in the financials?
Look, it's less in the fight. So when you talk about, the numbers and what the numbers reflect, the numbers don't tell you the story. You have to ask questions. You have to have the right
Mm.
conversations to understand the story. So why, so for example, I'll give you an interesting one in that talking to a friend of mine who has worked in a very successful, significant Australian startup. And he believed that there was a misalignment between the CEO's behavior and what was conducive to a great leadership team. Now, the problem, he could talk to me about the problem. And I said, well, hang on a minute, this business is going great. It's growing fast. And his view was, well, if you fix that problem, it'd be growing a lot faster. So you can't just look at the numbers. I mean, the numbers tell, I shouldn't downplay the numbers because there's a lot to the financial reporting and the numbers that can tell you about efficiency, but they'll only tell you where you are today. It's like looking in the rearview mirror. So unless you're really looking around you at the conditions and talking to all the passengers in that car, you're not going to know where the misalignment is. Now, misalignment is obvious. It's obvious. Most CEOs will know. It's a question of what conviction they have to spending time on those things. So it could be, starts
Mm.
with, is my leadership team the right team for what we're trying to accomplish? Now, the interesting thing is the only way that I know to determine that is to make sure that the business of that leadership team is clear and it's cascaded through action, layer by layer, cross-functionally, not within functional pipes. So let me give you an example.
Mm.
If we say that our priority as a leadership team is to improve customer satisfaction, in the old days, the leadership team would turn up with their nation of origin in front of them. I'm sales, I'm marketing, I'm finance, I'm legal. And then they would finish saying, yes, we're going to improve customer sat. They would all walk away and do their own plans and come back and present what they were going to do on customer sat. The interesting thing is that they were probably going to do the same thing anyway. So you haven't really changed what they were going to do a lot. And what also happens is that if some poor person gets allocated, for example, one of the things to do within that strategy of improving customer satisfaction, it could be implement a new CRM system. Usually that's given to someone who then fights the organization, and it's hell trying to get everybody lined up to adopt the new CRM. So you can't do things like that. And you can't have executives around the table who are negotiating on their functional behalf. You have to have executives around the table who say, I am here to serve and sacrifice for what is right for this organization. That is it. You don't have that, you're in trouble. And guess what? 80% of leadership teams do not go to the level they need to here because it's hard. It's hard work. So how do you do it? It's really, really quite simple, but hard to do. You take great customer sat, and as a leadership group, you don't leave the room unless you've agreed what the top 3 to 5 actions are to do that. So you all commit. Now you can go away and do some work and come back, but you as a leadership team must agree what are those things. Implementing a new CRM system could be one. Then what you do is you say, who's the leader around the table? Who are the supporters? So it could be, we're going to give IT the job to lead this, but customer, sales and marketing have to be involved as supporters. And then you say, okay, the 3 of you go off and come back and tell us the next level of plans or action. So we're getting really into the micro, right down to who's doing what work this quarter. And it's only for the most important things, Alena. So this is not for everything that goes on. These are our top priorities as an organization. These are the things that we as a leadership team all care about. And then you get down through this level order planning, which I write about in my book. which was taught to me in my 40s. That's how long it took before I learned how to do alignment of this nature. And you then make sure that whoever the person is that ends up with the action, they commit. So they have to commit to the action. Now, if they say, I don't have the resource, that's exactly why the leaders need to be there. Okay, you don't have it. What else are you doing? Maybe we can stop you doing that. Or guess what? We're going to give you more money because we agree you need more money. Or we say, you know what? We're at capacity right now. We can't do the strategy. So we'll defer. But that closes the conversation. If leadership teams do that, and it's no matter what size the bigger you are, the more complex it is to do. But the reality is once you do that, you create real alignment over who's doing what to who. And just recently, I spoke to a group and there was a fellow in the room and he's talking about a very high profile CEO of a very high profile organization. And he says, our CEO is fantastic. And I said, right, yeah, why do you say that? Really clear on where we're heading, really clear on what our priorities are. And I said, well, that's fantastic. Later on, I'm talking about this very subject. And the fellow speaks up and says, that's my problem. I'm in this function trying to get this strategy executed, but my peers in the other functions aren't aligned with me. And so the resources aren't there for me to do what I need to do because they're not supporting me. And I just paused and I said, whose fault is that? And he paused and he said, maybe our CEO isn't doing as good a job as I thought. And the reality is they're not. And a lot of these guys grew up in steady state organizations. Yes, they go through their changes, but they're in their field of discipline. They only know these big environments and they don't realize that their job actually is execution. It's not vision. Vision is important, but it's 20%, 80% is execution. So that's an example of so you can, I'll tell you how I uncover misalignment. I ask the leaders on a leadership team, rate out of 10, how well aligned your team is to execute the agreed strategy. You'll be shocked at what the scores are. And it's only because they don't get into the level of detail that I just described. Good companies executing well will score a 6 on that quite regularly. 7 if they're pretty good. But the opportunity to be a lot better is there. And then you just say, well, what do we need to do to be more aligned? I mean, that's where it starts. Where is the misalignment? Just ask the question and it'll be about people, process, programs. Some element of your organization could be, we're misaligned with this new trend in the market. That's okay. That's an external misalignment. That's just as vital.
I can also see that alignment process, which makes a lot of sense, and I can see how that would be extremely effective. It kind of brings me back to that focus, because you and I would both see companies that are just doing far too much.
Yeah.
So they commit to all of this work and go, yes, these are our strategic priorities, and yes, these are the projects we're going to do. But don't worry, guys, you'll keep doing what we plan to do anyway.
Yeah.
And so I can kind of see where you need that person at the top, a little bit like you said with Steve Jobs, that says, this is what we're not going to do. And I'm guessing that conversation, to an extent, needs to also happen in that same manner that you just described.
Yeah, look, Aldi Australia is the example I write about in my book. Tom Daunt was the CEO of Aldi Australia. They've been a phenomenal business success in recent years. And Tom heard me speak and contacted me and said, Steve, talk to me about alignment. That's the thing that I'm struggling with. And Tom had actually, because he's a really disciplined, he's an outstanding CEO. Even more recently, I had a chat with him, and he's still questioning his own. I think I'm getting good at this. I'm not sure, right? So he's a really humble guy, and he's now running Aldi internationally. Like he's the co-CEO of Aldi Sud, which is the US market, European market, still got Australia and New Zealand. So phenomenal executive, very successful. But he said, I've done a stock take. Bottoms up, my executives are doing 150 projects. He said, what do I do with those when I still can't get them engaged on the top level stuff that we've agreed is most important. And so what we did is I kicked him off and he did this. I didn't do it. He did it. He did this level order process and got to a point where the top down priorities clashed with bottoms up. And then he just said, you know what?
Mm.
There's no negotiation, top down, because you guys have got resource to do a lot of your own stuff. So you're just going to have to stop doing it. And you know what? Tom's philosophy was similar to mine. I don't try and stop people down here doing everything they're doing. I just say, I'm not compromising on the most important things. So you make the resource trade-off that's necessary. I'm not going to hear of it because you're already working on all these chosen to work on. So the idea
Yeah.
is not to worry too much about stopping people doing work. It's to make sure that they're doing the work you really believe needs to happen. That's a much more positive way.
Mm.
And when you get some people who play the game and they'll say, oh, Steve, I can't do that because I've got this other stuff I'm doing that's so important to you. And you say, okay, well, let's
Mm.
go through it all. But there's plenty that will just say, yeah, I get it. I need to prioritize. So, yeah, so that's hopefully a good example of how that can get dealt with.
It is a great example. And actually, one of the things as we kind of start to wrap up and land the plane a little bit, you've talked a little bit about startup versus mature corporate. And then we've kind of alluded to size a little bit. I'm curious, what is the size limit of company that you find the process that you've just described and you help organizations go through? At what size does that kind of tap out?
Hmm. It doesn't, because Microsoft is a great example. Microsoft, I always say with Microsoft, one of the real strengths Microsoft has is the ability to roll exec intent into action of people at the front
Mm.
line. It's laser focused. I used to joke before recent successes that they've had, because I love Microsoft as a company. It was one of the best companies, if not that I've worked with. But I used to joke that they can execute the wrong strategy really well. And watch out when they get there. When they get strategically right, watch out. And that's exactly what happened. They were
Hmm.
executing well under Steve Ballmer. And by the way, Steve Ballmer deserves a lot of credit for where Microsoft is today. But Satya was able to kind of reorient the company in a way that was really helpful. And because the execution muscle was there, it worked. And they've got hundreds of thousands of people. It just comes down to this. As a leader, you have to be even more disciplined, surrounded by even more disciplined leaders if you really want to drive alignment. And I'll tell you, even in Microsoft today, and I don't think I'm speaking out of term because I talk about any technology company, you live misalignment, because even though you might be getting good results today, you will know that where you are today is not where you want to be in 5 years. And so as a leader, you're
Mm.
constantly dealing with, we have to keep changing. We have to keep changing. So there's no organization, in my opinion, that is too big to be able to implement the disciplines required of a CEO to align effectively.
What would inhibit a large company, a large mature company? Like, this has got to be much harder if you're a large mature company that historically has lived in a steady state environment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The advantage I've had is being at the front end of technology change for so long and living
That's right.
change. For
Yeah.
those who haven't, it's really tough. It's really tough
Mm.
because, again, your reality is what you've experienced. You can listen. So I'll give you an example of something that I do say. Okay, if you're serious about change, you need leadership everywhere, right? Not just at the top. Leadership is not about position. Leadership is about an individual's willingness to identify an issue, gather support around them, and get that issue fixed. That's leadership. Now, in an organization that's facing change, which is all of us, we have to have leaders everywhere. And I don't buy everybody can lead. Everybody does lead in some shape or form, in some form of their life. It may not be at work because they're not passionate, but there'll be something that they will be a leader in. It could be a hobby, it
Mm.
could be a sport, it could be family. So we can all be leaders because we can all deal with change. We all have, and we all will continue to have to deal with change in our lives. Um, so it comes down to this. If you want to have great leaders everywhere, you need great people leaders. And the first thing that I would test in a lot of these organizations that you talk about is, what's the stock of people leaders that you have? How good are they at their job? Are they good people managers? Are they growing and developing their talent? And then invariably they'll say, "Oh, well, we're not quite." Some of them are really good, but a lot of them got there because they had technical skills and got promoted, in a sense, sometimes to be kept and to get a pay rise. And my view is that's really,
Mm,
really bad. It's really bad. We have to stop that. Find other ways to pay your professionals more for their skill and their experience, and make sure your people leaders are the right people, because they are the critical link between your intention and then what really happens at the front line. So that's just one example. It's what I'm going to be talking
yeah.
about. What I'm talking about, I'm actually giving a couple of speeches next week, is really about this whole notion of the disciplines around leading change and dealing with misalignment. One of the disciplines we talked about today was intention to action. Another one we talked about today was the leadership team. We're just talking about another one, which is having great people leaders. And we also talked about clarity of focus and saying no to good ideas. That's a fourth one. So four of the, we talked about getting over yourself, which is the fifth one.
Yeah. That's where we
So
started.
we've almost covered everything. Like, there's a couple of others I'm trying to think that we haven't necessarily jumped into, but actually, it's not a bad one to finish on, which is getting over yourself is really, and we did actually cover it, but it's more about putting yourself in the best position to be the best version of you in order to find and deal with
Mhm.
misalignment, because it's hard. It's difficult conversations. It's tough choices. It's really facing into what you actually want to turn your back on at times.
Mm. And I really love and appreciate that you've kind of ended our conversation there, because it brings me back to the little powwow we had before we hit record, which was, life is just hard at times, and we need to do what we can to get through that so we can show up and be our best selves. And I don't think we used the word in the conversation, but in a lot of it, and certainly uh, through your experience at NineMSN, there must just be that feeling of surrender. I
Mm.
just need to surrender to my ego. I need to surrender to the environment. I need to surrender to how we used to do things, or what got us here. And we need to embrace the change, be really disciplined. I love that you have used that word. In fact, I've circled it, the big circle. I think discipline, and I get the sense that we all shy away from discipline, get a little bit lazy and unfocused.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I can see that coupled with that execution muscle is critical. I've loved this conversation, Steve, and I must say I personally learned so much. So thank you. How do people learn more about what you do? You obviously speak a lot. What's the best way for people to learn more and perhaps contact you if they want to learn more?
Yeah, well, thanks. Look, first of all, thanks, Alena, for having me. And also thanks for the question. The conversation only as good as the questions and the thinking that comes from the host. And I really enjoyed it. And I think you led me to a whole bunch of things of real substance and importance. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. The best way to be connected to me, LinkedIn is good, because I'm also posting on there regularly, just little tips and lessons and learnings. I've got a website, which is stevevamos.com. So that's a good one to go to. You can actually download some speaker notes that I've got on that website. And also, if you want to register, there's going to be a lot more coming, because now that I'm clearer about where I'm going, I really want to see if I can share what I've learned with more people going forward. So they're the best ways to stay connected with me.
Fantastic. And how do people get a copy of your book? I think
Probably
there's so
Amazon.
much more that's going to offer.
Yeah, Amazon is a great place to go, just a most convenient way to get it. And I think with my book, just one thing I'll say, it's not just the what and the why, it's the how. So I share in there a whole bunch of the tools I use to drive alignment, to seek to get clarity, to have a difficult conversation, all those things that are really practical challenges that we all face and we never fully master. me included. But there are things I go back to when I'm struggling a bit.
I love that. Sounds like it'll be a wonderful anchor. Like you say, we all sort of go off course.
Everyone who's read it says it's fantastic. People just need to read more books, don't they? Stop watching TikTok
Sure do.
and read books.
I love that. Thank you so much, Steve. I've had the best time today talking with you. I'm already thinking about our next conversation. So thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and generosity today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
And what a great chat with Steve. That was just incredible, and I learned so much. And that leads us right into our listener question. And if you want to submit a listener question, you can now email us at realmathofbusiness@gmail.com, or you can leave a comment on YouTube or Spotify, and we'll hopefully get it into a future episode. This week's question is from Cam. Hi, Cam. Hi, Alena. I have been running a small real estate agency for 8 years in New South Wales. Listening to your podcast, I don't know how much of my training happened under people that were good at the people side of business, at least when it came to team members. It was a lot of numbers and sales, not so much mentorship. What are some easy tips for becoming better at the people side of business, especially for people who may not have had a lot of great bosses? Best, Cam. Great question, Cam. And I just going to pick up on your nuance of not that good at the people side of business, at least when it came to team members. And I think what you're alluding to there, Cam, is you may have worked for leaders that were great at people up, but maybe not people down. And that's the experience that you feel like you might be lacking. Now, I could go on for hours and hours, and I could give you trainings and all of the rest of it on the people side of business. But what I thought I would do instead is kind of point you in the right direction of things that might be easy to access and might be interesting for you when it comes to team leadership. So the first thing, I would get your hand on a few books. Not too many books, but just a couple of books that talk about team leadership. I mean, there are so many out there. I'm looking at my bookshelf now. You know, one of the more recent ones that I think of that I really enjoy is Seth Godin's most recent book, The Song of Significance. Another great book, it's not so much a team leadership book, but it is an interesting view of organizations and therefore teams, is one of my favorites, Simon Sinek's The Infinite Game. What I like about that is it kind of shifts your perspective on business, and it talks about certain roles, particularly in the executive team. And I think just unpacking that more human side and different perspective of what business is and how people inside business should look at it, I think that could be very helpful, because fundamentally, when it comes to people leadership, it just comes down to knowing your people. Right? Steve just mentioned it. We are in the business of humans. And so it's really just sitting down, and saying, who are you? What lights you up? So a really practical tip you could do, Cam, is just find 2 or 3 people as a starting point and just go and learn more about them. Yeah. If you've got a team of direct reports and indirect reports, maybe think of, select one direct report, one indirect report, take them out for a coffee and just learn about them. What lights you up? What do you love most about your job? What do you love most about life outside of work? Just learn more about them, because once they're, when it comes to people leadership, there really is no one size fits all. Yeah, it's got to be bespoke. I've got a saying, influence happens one person at a time. Yeah, we can't do people leadership. We need to lead individual people. The other sort of easy thing you could do is follow great people leaders on LinkedIn. So think about the people that you admire, that you see do great people leadership, or even that just talk a lot about team leadership and leadership in general, and follow them on LinkedIn. Make sure they come up in your algorithm. Instagram, many of those people leaders are on, or leadership experts are on Instagram as well. And so just kind of getting that front of mind for you, so you are being exposed on a constant basis to other ideas. Because again, I come back to, we are just leading other humans. Yeah. And so, yes, you can do a big training course, you can deep dive, you can write a thesis on it, you could write your own book on it. But quite frankly, it sounds to me, Cam, you just need a few little, to start with, bite-sized pieces of information to get your juices flowing, so then what does people leadership mean to me? How might I like to be a great leader? I would identify in your business, Cam, one great people leader. I guarantee you have one. You know, go and find it. Go and find them. Talk to them. Find out how they have developed their people leadership skills. Find out who they admire, who they hang out with, because I guarantee they will be the gateway to more great people leaders. So I hope those little tips have been helpful, Cam. The one thing I will say, the enabler in all of this is people leadership takes time. So you must, in these early stages, don't think it'll happen by osmosis. Don't think you're going to suddenly turn your water cooler conversations into these great, deep people leadership conversations or empathy map type explorations. Take it slow, take it small. Maybe 30 minutes a day in your calendar. Just block it out. It's where you might read a book. You might look on LinkedIn and read a blog. You might go and have that conversation with your team member or a great people leader in your business. 30 minutes in your calendar every day. What does people leadership mean for me? How would people leadership be successful in this business? And how can I be the best people leader possible? Might be 3 good anchoring questions for you to explore in that time. Great question, Cam. People leadership is a real passion of mine. I think we need to be leader-led when it comes to people leadership. So more people that are asking great questions like you gives me a lot of hope. So thank you. And thank you for listening to The Real Math of Business with Alena Bennett. If you liked this episode, remember to subscribe for more content and stay on top of the real math of business. I've been Alena Bennett. Thank you so much for listening.